Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, let's jump right in, because we are looking at a space that's evolving at just breakneck speed. Today, we're unpacking the rapidly shifting legal cannabis market. You know, if you haven't been paying close attention lately, you might actually think this story hasn't changed a whole lot since that very first wave of legalization. But under the surface, major regulatory shifts are actively unlocking massive, completely untapped financial potential. We're going to analyze exactly how the gears of government and society are turning right now, and what that actually means for the broader investment landscape.
I mean, just think about this single staggering number. $2.5 billion. That's the revenue generated by the legal cannabis industry in July alone. Literally, just let that sink in for a second. This instantly establishes the incredible financial scale of the industry today, because despite heavy federal restrictions and constant everyday operational friction, this market is an absolute financial force. It's essentially printing money, which proves that the underlying consumer demand is rock solid and, frankly, incredibly lucrative.
So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The cannabis industry today. 2. Normalizing through regulation. 3. A shift in society. 4. The investment landscape. And 5. Future market catalysts.
Section 1. The cannabis industry today.
It's honestly kind of hard to believe, but we're looking at roughly 20 years of market evolution here. We have moved way past the initial hype cycle. You know, that period where just the mere mention of the word cannabis would send a stock absolutely soaring on pure speculation. Today, we are looking at a fully established revenue-generating industry. The Wild West days are really transitioning into a period of serious operational execution. We're seeing companies demonstrate real fundamentals and making serious money.
However, the current landscape is still defined by some profound contradictions, or really a massive industry mismatch. As experts like CB1 Capital CIO, Todd, have pointed out, we're seeing a huge disconnect between strong, consistent revenue generation and surprisingly poor stock performance. Why is that? Well, a primary reason is the lack of access to traditional state and federal banking systems. It's incredibly difficult for these massive, multi-million-dollar enterprises to operate without basic banking services. And actually, that's exactly why evolving access to the New York Stock Exchange for certain cannabis names is just such a massive deal right now. It offers a unique catalyst for capital and legitimacy that most of the industry is literally still starving for.
Section 2, normalizing through regulation.
Which brings us to the political and regulatory environment. According to the analysis of CB1 Capital CIO, we're witnessing a very distinct shift in how the government handles the sector. He notes that the Trump administration has functionally treated cannabis like a real established industry, taking active steps to normalize it. And this is a totally critical perspective for our explainer today, because it really highlights how the federal posture has evolved from outright rejection into one of pragmatic structural normalization.
Structurally, this plays out across a few interconnected regulatory hurdles that are being tackled as we speak. Market clarity is what investors desperately need, right? And getting that clarity requires resolving state banking access so these companies can actually store and move their cash securely. It also requires clear guidance from the Treasury and the IRS, just so these businesses can be taxed fairly and predictably. And importantly, it involves the really complex process of rescheduling for adult use. Clearing these specific hurdles is what's going to finally unleash the industry's full potential.
Assessing this whole environment, Todd from CB1 Capital summarizes the administration's regulatory approach with the phrase, promises made and promises kept. In his professional view tracking these financial and legal catalysts, the administration has been thoughtful and consistent in delivering on its specific campaign promises regarding the industry, which really shifts the regulatory climate compared to previous eras. And for investors, that kind of consistency is the absolute bedrock of future forecasting.
Section 3. A shift in society.
Over the last decade or so, we've seen a really fascinating bifurcation in consumer demand. On one hand, you've got the market for cannabis as an everyday intoxicant, basically serving as a direct alternative to alcohol. But on the other hand, there's this rapidly expanding, highly technical market for medical and wellness therapeutics. These are two completely different consumer profiles, but both are growing exponentially, which just goes to show that cannabis is integrating itself into so many different facets of our everyday society.
But as society embraces all this, the rules of everyday life are totally lagging behind. Just like we have strict open container laws for alcohol to regulate how it's consumed in public, experts anticipate that specific public consumption regulations for cannabis are inevitably going to be implemented as everyday societal use normalizes. And let's be honest, the distinct smell of cannabis becomes an all too common feature of public breezeways and city sidewalks. Local and state governments are going to be forced to step up and create comprehensive, sensible public consumption frameworks.
Section 4. The investment landscape.
So, if you're a patient cannabis investor right now, the current market might be seriously testing your nerves. As highlighted in our source material, adjacent sectors are just exploding. Psychedelic stocks, for example, they've surged massively, up 5, 6, even 700%. It's completely natural for cannabis investors to be watching those numbers with intense envy, while their own sector is just sitting there waiting for final regulatory clarity. But you know what? That patience might be exactly what sets up the biggest opportunities. Take a company like Village Farms, for instance. This is a prime example of an organization quietly and efficiently consolidating its power, while the rest of the market just waits. They boast a massive $1 billion top-line revenue. They have an international European footprint that's second to none. And get this, they're led by a retired Navy captain. They aren't just surviving the regulatory friction, they are building an absolute powerhouse of a foundation just waiting for the gates to open.
And paying attention to those fundamentals is absolutely crucial. When you look at their valuation, CB1 CIO notes that Village Farms is trading super cheap, at less than half, if not a third of its earnings, compared to its industry peers. This is exactly the kind of setup we see in industries that are constrained by regulation rather than demand. When outside institutional adoption finally hits the cannabis market, companies with this kind of massive top-line revenue and low valuation are positioned for truly explosive growth.
Section 5. Future Market Catalysts.
Here is the concrete timeline expected by industry experts, and it starts imminently, with final briefs expected next week for adult use rescheduling. Once that goes live, we look toward the midterms, where broader regulatory and banking clarity is expected to finally take shape. And then, running parallel to all of this, is the highly anticipated release of specific IRS and Treasury guidance. It's basically a domino effect. One regulatory hurdle falling triggers the exact next one, clearing the path for massive institutional capital.
But here's the catalyst that completely flies under the radar unless you know exactly what to look for: IRS-backed taxes. According to market analysts, updated Treasury and IRS guidance could result in back taxes being returned specifically from medical marijuana operations, and we aren't talking about a small tax return here. Ironically enough, we are talking about the federal government potentially returning billions of dollars in capital directly back onto the balance sheets of these companies. This would be a monumental, fundamental shift in the financial health of the entire medical cannabis sector.
Which brings us to the ultimate question you should take away from this explainer today. As these long-standing regulatory roadblocks finally begin to fall, how will the looming billions in back tax relief totally reshape the balance sheets of the global cannabis market? We are standing right on the precipice of a massive financial unlocking. The demand is clearly there, the revenues are already in the billions, and the final regulatory dominoes are teetering. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep a close eye on those balance sheets, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.